Okay, class, today is Monday, May 4th, day 16 of our Civil Rights Unit. So, a lot of big things happening this week. This is the new start of the fourth quarter. I did have one assignment that I had in that in between week that I'll be putting in progress book today, and you'll be able to see that. Remember, fourth quarter is a more traditional quarter, and today we've got a lot of things. We're not doing too many notes, we're talking about hippies some more and that won't take too long. But if you are in third period honors, make sure you click on the other video where you get the rubric for the essay, and I'll explain how that essay is going to be broken up into weekly assignments. And then for first, fourth, sixth, and seventh, we have a document of the week due by the start of your class this Friday. And again, if you don't know how to attach a document to something I'm sharing with you, I'll have a little video for you to be able to see how to do that. And again, this is a much more traditional week. We're also going to have another worksheet probably tomorrow, and most importantly, test Friday. So for Friday's test, it's going to be a specific window. Right now, I'm probably going to post, I would say, at 1 o'clock. I think that's my leaning, unless I hear from some of you that that's a terrible time. And you'll have to log in, and it will just appear at 1 o'clock in your classroom. And you'll have to click on it, and you'll only have that 45-minute time period to complete that. So make sure you start preparing for that. If you haven't done all of the assignments that I gave over the last 3-4 weeks, it, that third quarter's over. But make sure you watch those lectures so that get those notes so you know what we're testing on. This is traditionally a pretty successful test for students. So it's a lot to catch up on, but let's go ahead and jump into the hippie stuff for today. Our goal is to continue discussing who the hippies are and counterculture. We're also going to describe one positive and one negative effect of the counterculture movement. So there's some good things that we have from the hippies and some things that aren't great lasting legacies. So last note I'd left you off with was that hippies affected the mainstream culture tremendously. Even if somebody wasn't quote unquote a hippie, they're probably influenced by some part. And if you watch the Friday Fun Day video, and by the way, you should, because some of you have document of the week passes and you might want to watch it just to find that. But they had a lot of influence on mainstream culture, even if you weren't quote unquote a hippie. So one way I'll talk about is diet. In general, hippies believed in a much more natural diet. Health food stores became much more common. The idea of becoming a vegetarian became much more common. It's just trying to get back to natural things. Again, that kind of goes to the hairstyle thing. You just let your hair grow natural. You don't have haircuts. Everything's again supposed to be just sort of back to an easier way of doing things. I think would be the theory. That has its downsides. If you watch the Fun Day video, I showed you what it's like to eat grape nuts. Not awesome. But there's a lot of positive in this too. I mean, there's a lot to be said about eating food that doesn't have a lot of chemicals in it to make it taste a certain way that we find out later on in some cases may cause cancer. Fashion. I think this one's even more common than diet. People dress a certain way. The hippies had a certain look, and even if you look back at some pictures of your grandparents or something like that might have grown up in the 60s or 70s, you might see really long or really big hair and some really big collars and some bell-bottom pants. That doesn't mean they were a hippie, but it means obviously they were influenced by the fashion of hippies. And so that would mean, tie-dyed, colorful, fringe, beaded, anything that you could make kind of on your own. And again, long or natural, whatever your hair would look like if you just let it go for a month or two or three or a year. One of my uncles famously didn't cut his hair for 2 years. Really, really long hair. And then I mentioned before, one of my uncle's best friends, Dean, happened to be African American. I don't know how long he had been growing out his hair, but it was ginormous. It's just this just huge afro, and it's just the way things were. That's just whatever was going to be natural was the way you should look, according to the hippies. Now, ironically, and I showed a tie-dyed shirt in the Friday Fun Day. A lot of people made money off of making things look hippie-ish, you could tell this is not a true tie-dyed shirt because you could never yourself twist a shirt and create that iconic design. Now, this one here, I suppose it'd be possible if you were really, really good at it. But I'm going to tell you, uh, I never saw anybody make one that good. So, uh, again, too, the trick would be making things, just making things look like there's a look to not caring what you look like. Um, today, if you criticize this too much, I'll just say that, I buy clothes for somebody in high school too. My youngest son is, a senior, and I've bought plenty of jeans that were already distressed, already frayed at the bottom, already had holes in them. That's essentially the hippie look. Uh, my mom said you knew a pair of jeans were really worn in when the patches you had to put in the holes had patches. If your patches had patches, you were all set. Art. Uh, Boy, talk about the subject I know least about. But if any of you are lucky enough to have Mr. Shannon or any of our other, or Mr. Brown or any of our other great art teachers, um, probably a little bit about hippie art, at least one particular hippie artist, which would be Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol, one, liked a lot of colors, but two, what he would basically do is take an everyday item and make it just this huge portrait. I think this is one of his most famous ones, a Campbell soup can. And you're like, why would you do like a 6 foot by 3 foot giant mural of a soup can? And people just eat it up and buy these things because he was making fun of the consumerism of American society. Some people love this. I just think it looks dumb, but I get it. I understand the concept of it. Another thing that he liked to do was he would make a photo or a drawing, a painting of somebody famous like Marilyn Monroe, and then replicate that maybe a dozen or whatever 20 times to make one larger painting. And you could see one of Andy Warhol himself over here. Yeah, it's for some people, not for me. When I think of hippie art, everybody else, I think of like I definitely saw a lot of microbuses that had custom paint jobs like this, and I always thought those were kind of fun and cool. Music. Here's the one that I would say is, I think most people would argue, the biggest influence of the hippie movement. Music in this era absolutely changed the music industry and music in general. So, rock and roll emerges in the 50s, and in a way, rock and roll is the music for this new generation of kids, for the kids that we think of as the baby boomers, but at the time, were the hippies. You know, all these kids born after World War II, everything was so focused on them because, their parents wanted them to have everything. And one of the things that really develops for them is a whole new music genre. And really, if you want to trace the roots of this, you go Chuck Berry and Little Richard first. So there's Little Richard, and there's Chuck Berry. And because this is the 50s, I would think you can make it's almost undeniable that music was still very segregated in who listened to what. And so rock and roll is essentially has its origins with African American musicians. And then you have men in the late 50s like Elvis who kind of, well, you can either say on the positive side influenced by or on the negative side stole sort of that style and genre, and then introduces it to everybody else in culture, and you have this rock and roll. And so those are the three early pioneers. But I want to be real clear and give credit where credit is due. I think Chuck Berry and Little Richard, by all accounts, should come before Elvis. Elvis may have just introduced it to more of the uh, white culture, and fortunately this merges and it just becomes rock at rock and roll, and everybody enjoys it. That's one of the things of the hippies. They don't care if you're black, white, Hispanic, male, female, whatever. That's one of the best things that come out of the hippie movement. But by the late, well, mid to late 60s, music changes again. See, rock and roll in the 50s is revolutionary in its style and its sound, but the lyrics generally were, I'll just say, Nothing to write home about. The lyrics were just often speaking about very generic sort of bubblegum pop type things. But by the mid 60s and late 60s, musicians are addressing real issues. They're addressing the things that hippies have grown to become upset about. It might be about the war, it might be about the counterculture. And artists like, let's go through each one of these, the Beatles. The Beatles, who start off with sort of bubblegum pop and then evolve into real provocative music that is talking about real change that they want to see. Let's see. Who do I have next? Bob Dylan. That's probably this. Yep, yep. Bob Dylan, I think, has one of the. I wish you were in class and I could play all these excerpts of songs. I worry about copyright for playing it on YouTube. But Bob Dylan, if you want to just Google something from him, some music by him, boy, does he have a weird voice. Some people really like it. It's one of the most distinctive voices you'll ever hear. I think if he wasn't such an amazing songwriter, you would just say, oh, he doesn't sing well. But his writing is absolutely out of control. He writes hit songs for all of these other artists that we'll talk about. And boy, does he address everything from racism to sexism to materialism, the war. Uh, Dylan is one of my favorite writers of all time. I just don't love his voice. Where did Janis Joplin go? I seem to have lost Janis Joplin. Oh, no, there's Janis Joplin. Uh, Janis Joplin, a female singer of the era, again, very powerful voice, lots of strong messages. And then Jimi Hendrix, again, powerful messages. As a matter of fact, particularly with some writing that he shared with Bob Dylan, probably the greatest guitar player ever to live. Someone will probably argue with me about that, but right up there at the very least. And just as a side note, things you don't see as much today, although some of you might be back into collecting albums. Album covers got so intense. I mean, just people wanted, the latest album by Jimi Hendrix or the Beatles or whoever it might be. But this is an example of an album cover by the Beatles. And boy, did people go nuts trying to read all the hidden messages in here. So this is the Beatles, and you'll notice that Paul McCartney, who's the lead singer, he's barefoot. And so some people started a rumor that he was dead because for a few months he wasn't really making public appearances. And when you're buried, you're often buried barefoot. And then there are license plates in the background that have hidden messages in them, and oh, it's just crazy. But I want to talk about the lyrics a little bit more. Uh, so lyrics again, I told you that 50s, early 60s, they're sort of bubblegum pop, and then they start to throughout the 60s expand into what they're talking about. So I'm going to give a few examples. I cannot sing, nobody wants that, but I'm going to read a few examples of lyrics and we'll evolve here a little bit. So early 60s, I've got a Beatles song called Love Me Do. So I'm going to read it as all music can be read as a poem, and I'm going to ask you if you think this sounds real meaningful. So here we go. Love Me Do by the Beatles. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please love me do. Woo woo. Love me do, love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please love me do. Woo woo. I don't think anybody's world is going to be changed by this song. Uh, it's a pop hit, but the lyrics are, I think we could say, vapid. Now, by the mid 60s, what you have, and you have this today, I realize, is you have lyrics that are talking to this generation, but they're doing so in code. And so by doing so in code, the kids are getting one message, and parents that hear it might hear a different message. And boy, that really relates to the hippies at the time because they're like, oh, you're speaking to me directly. So I'll give you an easy example might be Puff the Magic Dragon. I know that somebody in my honors class is writing an essay about that. Um, that's probably pretty easy to figure out what they might be talking about. Uh, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles. Lucy, L, Sky, S, Diamonds, D. It's about LSD. But I'll read some lyrics from Mr. Tambourine Man. Uh, this was written by Bob Dylan, but performed just as famously by the Byrds. So here we go. Uh, so take me for a trip upon your magic swirling ship. All my senses have been stripped, and my hands can't feel to grip. My toes Too numb to step, wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. Ready to go anywhere. I'm ready for it to fade. Onto my own parade, cast your dancing spell my way. I promise to go under it. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. Bob Dylan has very publicly and openly talked about how this was a song about his drug dealer, his connection for marijuana, for pot. So again, it's like a hidden language. Now, by the late '60s, they're just talking about things like your document of the week. It's war. Boy, it's very, there's no coded message there. He says, war, what's it good for? Absolutely nothing. um, this is a really weird song I'll read you, but there's no hidden message here. This is called Rainy Day Woman, number 12 and 35 by Bob Dylan. I'll give you a hint. There's nothing about rainy days, woman number 12 or 35 in this. It's a weird song, but I think you'll get his message. He doesn't hide it as much because he's just openly saying stuff now. Well, they'll stone you when you're at the breakfast table, and they'll stone you when you're young and able, and they'll stone you when you're riding in your car, and they'll stone you when you're playing your guitar. But I would not feel so all alone. Everybody must get stoned. Everybody must get stoned. Huh. Hard to say what he might be talking about there. Okay, so many feel the culmination of not just this music, but really also the hippie movement in general was this concert called Woodstock. Woodstock is an amazing cultural touchstone event. It is this 3-day concert that they had dreamed up where people were going to get to see all of their favorite artists. And we're talking about days and days of artists. I have the playlist here and just, you know, artists that today, I don't know how to compare it today. It would be as if you had people from all these different genres. They'd be like having Taylor Swift and Kanye on the same stage, and one of them not ripping an award away. It would be as if you had, like a heavy metal group along with a pop group, along with a rap group. It just, you have all these different genres that have one unifying feature that they have hippie views. They're against the war, they're against racism, they're against all these things. But you could just kind of see them all on one stage over this 3-day period. And they rented out this farm in New York, and they thought, about 110,000 will show up. In some ways, it's a mess. I mean, in a lot of ways, they oversold it. 400,000 people, some say almost 420,000 people showed up, and they ran out of food. They didn't have parking. People walked up to 10 miles away and just parked their cars on the side of the road. Uh, the bathroom situation is repulsive. It rained. There were problems with paying the artist. That the whole thing lost money. But people who went tend to remember it as this amazing event because here you have 400,000 people, virtually no security, not enough food. You could see today where that would cause some real problems. As a matter of fact, when they tried to do the 25th anniversary of it, they burned down the stage because a group sang a song called "Burn Stuff" or "Break Stuff." So in this event, there were no murders, there were no reported sexual assaults, anything like that. It just sort of proved to many people, hey, the hippies have this really chill vibe, and they can take care of things. However, uh, there are some downsides of course, the hippie movement. Their views on things did lead, particularly in regards to casual sex and drug use, terrible side effects like a huge increase in the number of STDs, and of course, overdoses and addiction. On the positive side, and this may very well show up on your version of the test, boy, did they do a good job bringing about attention to issues. They were still fighting for civil rights. They were fighting for women's rights, Hispanic American rights, Native American rights. I mean, that's very much a hippie value that you're cool with everybody. You're cool with all of this stuff. Why would you care if nobody's hurting anybody? You would just, let that stuff go. And they bring attention to the war in Vietnam. And this is an opinion, if you are not for the war in Vietnam, you would see this very much as a positive that they helped bring about the attention that ended the war in Vietnam. Now, if you thought the war in Vietnam was something that we should have continued, then I guess you'd view that as a negative. I'll do one last thing for today before we close out, and that a few pictures, just hippies in general. I don't like these images because that's sort of like a costume of hippies. I think that's a little bit more authentic, a little bit more authentic. Just long hair in general, whatever's natural, etc. This is a picture of Woodstock. Absolutely insane. That's what a sea of over 400,000 people look like. Um, just crazy how many people were there and how little damage was done. Um, yeah, at least, well, there was a lot of damage actually, but as far as to the people that were there, you didn't have the deaths that you had associated with other groups that tried to replicate this later on. Yep, those are hippies for sure. There's some fun pictures in your textbook too. Yeah, this is one of my favorites. It's just, yep, let's go to Goodwill and buy whatever we can and plop that into an outfit. That's kind of a Goodwill vibe or a hippie vibe. And then again, some more pictures from Woodstock. But I'll finish up on this graphic to kind of summarize the hippie movement. Okay, on all these different ideas. So, what would it be for fashion? Well, emphasis on used or homemade. Okay, what about values? They are against traditional values. So they're not really big on going to college or getting a job or getting married or following laws or waiting for certain things until they got married. How about race relations? They don't believe in racism. They just, everybody's cool. Food, a lot more vegetarian, a lot more natural or healthy foods. Living arrangements, a lot more communes. Art, anything that makes fun of everyday society or is handmade, Andy Warhol. Gender roles, they're not for sexism. This is when you start to see men start doing things that they should have been doing a long time, like changing diapers and taking care of kids. And hey, they're for equality. They want out of the Vietnam War, and of course, for music, rock and roll, and folk. Okay, I've hit you with a lot today. Make sure you take a peek at those assignments that you have for this week. They are due by the start of your class on Friday. Everybody be safe out there.